Just I'll welcome you, then start maybe. Okay, very good morning, and so welcome all of you to today's 75th Ananthakrishnan Colloquium. It's a new landmark, and today we have a speaker, Dr. Chirag Dhara. He is alumni of IITM. He was here with Dr. Krishnan as an RA few years ago, and he's actually having a PhD in physics as well as a PhD in earth science. So double PhD. So he is quite known in climate science, and so today he is going to talk about is India a good or bad indicator or performer on climate change. So thank you, Chirag, for giving a colloquium today, and nice to have you here today. So over to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is working fine, right? Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks very much for the opportunity to deliver this talk. And I'm really happy to be back in IITM again. It's been some time. All right. Is India a good or bad performer on climate change? A deliberately vaguely worded question, which I intend to define a little better and try to answer it the best I can. Actually, the more, I suppose, the less provocative title would be interpreting climate performance indices. Okay, and I'll just take you through what I mean by that. Indicators and indices are everywhere. Any complex system that we choose to control or to understand, we use indicators. It could be human health. It could be something like aviation. We have many dials and indicators about the health of the aircraft at any given time. It could be weather, and that's before the advent of sophisticated technologies. And in the financial sphere, it could be the stock markets, how they go up and down, and perhaps for the economy as a whole, the GDP. Is the GDP rising or falling? How fast is it rising? That gives you an indication of the health of the economy. Pertinent to this talk, most currently, we are trying to track the health of the entire climate in the context of climate change. And this is, of course, one of the hardest problems because this is multidimensional information which we are trying to comprehend in this vast, complex system. To do that, many indicators have developed, indices have developed. Three of the most well-known are the Environmental Performance Index up there, what's called the Climate Change Performance Index, and the Climate Action Tracker. Okay, in particular, I think the Climate Action Tracker has been around for a very long time and it's pretty well known. What these indices do is allow you to compare a country's performance among themselves or the same country over time, and gives you a sense for whether a country is doing better on climate change action. Usually that means mitigation. Here's what happened, and some of you might actually remember this. Back in 2022, the EPI, the Environmental Performance Index, they put out the results of their index, and it happened to place India last. That's rank 180. This is descending order. It placed India last on environmental performance, which kicked up quite a firestorm. This was, some of you may know Navroz Dubash and Sharad Lele. Navroz used to be at CPR, Sharad is still at A3 in Bangalore. They wrote this article about the EPI and they really called it out for its lack of emphasis on equity and various other reasons. So this was an op-ed in Indian Express. The Indian government took note as well and put out this is a screen grab from the website. And they put out this note also stringently critiquing the EPI, that they fail on various ways, which is why India is ranked last. So the government took notice. So this was a rebuttal to the EPI, and the EPI didn't take that lying down. The EPI issued a rebuttal to the rebuttal. So they put this up, saying, well, the Indian government is missing the point and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter. Okay, but it created quite a firestorm. The interesting thing was, later in the same year, 2022, the CCPI had put out its index and ranked India in the top 5 on climate change performance. The Indian ministry put out yet another note welcoming it this time. Okay, this happened in the same year. This is not unprecedented. Here in 2019, the German Watch issued a rebuttal to the Australian Prime Minister's rebuttal to CCPI placing Australia last, among the last countries, the worst performers on climate performance. So the question is, what is happening? Why are so many different indices coming up, and they all seem to disagree with each other? Many of them, they pretty strongly disagree with one another on something which seems objective. How is India performing, or Australia, or UK, or whatever, performing on climate change? And that's what the goal of this work is. What I intend to discuss is that choices made in index development can have a very big role in its outcomes. It can predispose indices towards certain outcomes. And the second part, I'm going to discuss the framework, a conceptual quantitative framework we've created, which can categorize these indices, which allows us to understand what outcomes would come even before you actually know the index itself. So just from the way it's constructed, you can tell what the outcomes will be and what its implications are. Okay, so first part. What I'm going to do here is compare the EPI score with the climate action tracker. These are two of the indices that I discussed in an earlier slide. The climate action tracker has categorical ratings. Okay, they rate countries as critically insufficient, highly insufficient, insufficient, almost sufficient. Almost sufficient in meeting its 1.5 degree goals. That's what it means. So a country ranked over here is obviously much better than a country ranked over here. The EPI gives a score, a quantitative numerical score between 0 and 100. And we're going to compare how the EPI and the CAT agree or disagree with each other. Here's how it looks. What we've done here is we've taken all those countries categorized as critically insufficient by the CAT, and we've taken the mean score on the EPI, and this is the range. So that's coming to about 35 something. Next, highly insufficient, the next higher category on CAT gets a slightly higher score on the EPI. The next group gets a still higher mean score on the EPI. But the curious thing is, the countries that are ranked highest by the CAT all of a sudden see a drop in the EPI scores. So the EPI is disagreeing on what countries are good performers relative to the climate action tracker. On the other hand, if you compare the CCPI, this is the CCPI with a CAT, you can see a generally rising average. Of course, whether it's significant, statistically significant is of course a question to be asked, but over here, more to the point, you don't see this funny behavior. So on aggregate, the CCPI appears to agree with the CAT more so than the EPI. And so we asked ourselves, well, what is it that the EPI is doing? And that answer actually comes when you compare the EPI and the CCPI. So this is EPI, that's CCPI. This is the one-to-one line. All the reds are the industrialized developed countries, what we call developed countries. The blues are what are categorized as developing countries. What you see is all the ones that deviate the most from the one-to-one line are the developing countries. That's where the EPI and the CCPI disagree with each other. In fact, the EPI is not ranking any developing country more than 50% on its scale. They're all ranked less than 50%. Okay, so there seems to be a distinction in between the EPI and the CCPI and how they evaluate developing countries. Okay, so why is that? What explains the low scores for developing countries? To diagnose this, we developed yet another metric. It's a diagnostic. It's not a metric we are proposing, it's a diagnostic metric. And the way we do that is we take the same EPI 2022, okay, which is comprised like this. The details are not that important, but just give you a sense of what we do. There is one indicator, which is projected greenhouse gas emissions in 2050, which has a very high weight, 36% of the entire index. There's another with the same weight, which is the growth rate in carbon dioxide in the last 10 years. Okay, and then there are a whole bunch of other indicators, but collectively they account for a very low weight, only 28%. So the way we develop the EPI equity is this way. We take this indicator and turn it into something called the fair share budget. Okay, I'll explain that during the discussion if anyone is interested. Right now, I want to emphasize a point of what it means. And even this indicator from the EPI 2022, we converted that into a slightly analogous but different indicator. Okay, keeping the weights the same. All these indicators we didn't change because their collective weight is quite low. 7 indicators with just 30%. The point is, the important point here is these are called fair share budgets, fair share carbon budgets. The point is this. The fair share budgets, the way they are constructed, they emphasize equity. Okay, and that, as I will discuss, makes a big difference. So this is just mapping out ranks on the EPI. Okay, the blues indicate the good performers, are close to in the top 10, top 20, and so on. The reds indicate the poor performers. As you can see, all of these developing countries, most of them, are ranked extremely poor. They're all in the reds. Whereas Europe in particular really stands out as a good performer collectively, the entire continent. Of course, US and Canada are still ranked pretty poorly, even on the EPI 2022. Next, I'm going to show you the EPI equity, the one that we developed. That's how it looks. Just changing 2 indicators from the EPI 2022 ends up virtually flipping the narrative. It's the developing world, what stands out as good performers from this perspective, and much of the industrialized countries, the global north, as they call it, stands out as bad performers from this perspective. But let's dig in a little deeper. Performance by region and development status. So first, by development status, I'm comparing EPI and the EPI equity. And these are ranks. So for developed countries, you can see that the median rank is around 50 on EPI, wide range, of course, but it ranks developing countries very poorly. They're close to 130. The median rank I'm comparing this as EPI equity. On the EPI equity, sorry about the miscommunication, on the EPI equity, the performance degrades dramatically. So from a median rank of 50, they drop to a median rank of almost 150 from this equity perspective. For developing countries, on aggregate, there's not a big difference, at least in terms of the median, there's not a big difference between the two.
Sorry, can you hold 2 minutes? Streaming is not changing slides.
Oh, I see.
Sorry.
Sure, no problem.
Chirag? When you say equity, what do you mean? Like taking into account the financial?
So the way fair share budgets are constructed is you take the cumulative emissions and then you take the population share of a country. For example, if we say India is 1 billion for the sake of argument, and the world population is 8 billion, and you take the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, then the share of the carbon budget India is entitled to would be 1/8, so about 12%. So that would be a fair share. What are they fairly entitled to in terms of carbon emissions? Yeah. So it's not the economy. It's well, it is indirectly connected to the economy, of course, the volume of emissions, but you define it directly in terms of the population share and the carbon budget. So,
So does that mean if we increase the population, we can increase the share?
well, that in principle, yes, but so what happens is when the population increases, the amount of emissions also rise. Now, if your emissions were constant, say for India, the emissions were constant, but the population increased, then you would increase the share. But then, basically, that is the assumption that the emissions remain the same. They're not. The emissions rise as the population rises.
But depends on what part of the population is increasing, because
Yeah,
even within the country, like
that's true.
India, maybe 80% of the emission is coming from 10-20% of the population,
That's true. That's very true.
which may not be increasing.
That's true. That's true. In fact, the bottom 50% is only 1 ton per capita, whereas the top 10% is about 11 tons per capita. So absolutely right. If the population share in the bottom 50% changes, the overall emissions will not change very much. But the share of the population. So this kind of a metric certainly does not take intra-country inequalities into account. You're just operating on the mean, which is, of course, it's got its own issues. But at the first level, we talk about inter-country inequalities, after which we should talk about intra-country inequalities. Okay, back to this. ये बताइए कुछ अगर काम नहीं कर रहा तो हाँ developing countries on aggregate there's no significant difference between the two metrics, but you see a big difference for the least developed countries. This is UNDP classification, by the way, United Nations Development Program. So on the EPI 2022, they're ranked extremely poorly. These are very high ranks. The median is about 150, whereas the equity perspective ranks them very highly. All this to show not that the EPI equity is a better measure, but that it really makes a difference what perspective your metric takes. The narrative can really flip on its head. I think I'm going to skip this region and move on because effectively I'm just going to emphasize the same message. Okay, so I'll just flip past these slides. Yeah. So equity can very strongly condition outcomes of indices. So just a quick takeaway from this part before we move on to the next. Well-known indices, they diverge considerably in their outcomes. Those were the scatter plots and so on that I showed earlier. Indices emphasizing equity can contrast starkly from those that do not. Divergent outcomes from indices can lead to conflicts, as we saw between governments and index makers. Australia, India being the cases in point. But the basis of the conflict can be obscured if the root causes remain unexplored. And that really is what leads to the second part of my talk, where we are creating an analytical framework to assess the perspectives embedded in performance metrics. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to take the case of Indonesia to make my case. Let's talk about India's climate performance in terms of its emissions, cumulative emissions. Okay, so one perspective is cumulative emissions, by which Indonesia ranks in the top 20 in the world. So one would consider that as being responsible, or substantially responsible for observed climate change. But then, if you take a fair share budgets perspective, and this is work done by Hickel, sorry, there it is. it has actually, Indonesia has used a very small fraction of the budget that would be allocated to it, a fair share's budget. And remember, this is depending on the share of the population.
Yeah. When you mean by cumulative emissions, with respect to which year?
1850.
50.
Historical cumulative emissions until present day.
Do you have data that was data?
Yeah, very much so. The data is available. So we know the cumulative emissions for all countries. Of course, some countries they partition, they split, they after the Soviet Union broke down, a lot of countries that were earlier part of a large collective, they became independent countries. So there are many assumptions that do go into it, but it's fairly well accepted nonetheless. Yeah. Okay, so we have, from a cumulative emissions perspective, Indonesia would be you would assess Indonesia as a substantial contributor to observed climate change. From a fair share budgets, it is not. So what we do is we use this as a basis for our conceptual framework. Okay. The cumulative emissions is what we call the biophysical approach to assessing a country's contribution. Okay, and this is important, is underpinned by the polluter pays principle, which is an ethical principle. It's also a legal principle in many countries. So if you pollute, you pay. And in fact, the OECD and so on, all the references are here. Back from the 1970s already, this is a very well-established principle. The fair share budgets is different. It is representative of what we might call a socio-economic approach. And that is underpinned by a different principle, which is right of equal access to the atmospheric commons, which is another ethical principle, which is very well established. In fact, I have not given the reference here, but Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, they were instrumental in creating this perspective. This is from 1991, still one of the highest cited papers, India in an Unequal World. Yeah. So they, in fact, were the ones that explicitly stated this as an ethical principle. And so the fair share budgets is reflective of this one. So we can visualize this as a space of perspectives. Axis represents the physical climate or the biophysical perspective, underpinned by the polluter pays principle. The other one is an equity, the socio-economic, meaning equity perspective, which is underpinned by yet another ethical principle, which is the equal access to commons. So neither perspective, what I'm trying to emphasize is, neither perspective is wrong. They both are based in ethical, scientific, and legal principles that have been long established in both the literature and in law, at least in this case. So the physical climate perspective is the way we formulate it. It is underpinned by absolute emissions. It's directly linked to warming, cumulative emissions. But the demerit is, it is completely indifferent to socio-economic concerns. Think about it like this. The atmosphere doesn't care about niceties like equity, equality, and so on. All it cares about is how much greenhouse gases have we added. And that's the physical climate perspective. But then we do care about these niceties of equality and equity, and that is reflected in the equity perspective, which is based on per capita emissions, and it gives insight into disparities in consumption between countries and within countries, but it is not directly linked to warming. Per capita emissions do not give you warming. It's cumulative emissions, the absolute emissions. Okay, so and here's what we do. We take this perspective space and we map indices directly onto the space. And that gives us some real insights into various things, as I'll point out. To do that, we examine each indicator of an index and we map them into these perspectives, onto the perspective space. So any indicator which emphasizes absolute emissions, is related to the physical climate perspective, kept emissions to the equity perspective. There is a quantitative framework, which I have a slide, but I'll show that during the discussion if you're interested in the details. Right now, I'll move on. So for example, the way we operationalize it is, we did the EPI 2022. You will recall this from earlier. Okay, this is how it's constructed. These two are related to absolute emissions, and therefore they would be mapped onto the physical climate perspective. The other indicators are a combination of some per capita and some absolute, and we'll map them accordingly. So here's how it finally looks when we do the mapping. So remember, physical climate perspective on one axis, equity perspective on the other, and low, medium, high is just a qualitative rating that we've given it. This is a result of the mapping. EPI sits on this axis and basically represents largely a physical climate perspective only. It doesn't represent the equity perspective when you do the mapping. CCPI is the exact opposite in some sense. It's the inverse, where it represents only the equity perspective and doesn't represent the climate perspective. The EPI equity is even more extreme. It represents predominantly and to a very high degree the equity perspective. The climate action tracker is a curious case. It is something of a compromise between the two. Yeah. So this framework actually allows us to understand many of the issues that I highlighted earlier. If you recall, there was a divergence between the EPI and the climate action tracker right in the first, one of the first slides of the results. And that you can see as this distance, a distance metric between the two in this perspective space. There's an even wider divergence. Remember, it flipped when we compared the spatial map of EPI versus EPI equity, it flipped. And you can see that reflected in this even wider difference on this in this perspective space between the EPI and the EPI equity. And that really flips the script, flips the narrative. If you recall, the CAT and the CCPI tended to agree with one another more so. And that's because when you cast them into the perspective space, they actually represent similar perspectives much more so. Here also explains India's rejection of the EPI because it represents predominantly a climate perspective, but not an equity perspective. And that makes India's performance look pretty poor, that perspective. It explains why India accepted the CCPI, because in fact, the CCPI does represent equity far more so. The same thing explains why Australia rejected it. It's too much equity for them. Australia looks bad from that perspective. You would assess it as a poor performer. The point of all this is, when we cast it into this form, it explains very many things about real-world conflicts and how indices and indicators, they agree or disagree with each other. So now what we can know for sure is that if you created a new index, and there were actually, after the EPI controversy was set off, there were people recommending that India should create its own index. Well, any such index you create can be mapped onto the same perspective space, and simply from the way it's created, if it lies over here, it will make India, it will assess India as a good performer. If it lies over there, it will be assessed as a bad performer. You don't even need to look at the results. The construction will tell you what it is. So, summary, interpretation. When we have these complex social environmental problems, there are invariably multiple perspectives. It's unavoidable. And I guess what makes it even more frustrating is they can all be based on ethical and scientific principles. And you can't simply outright reject any one of them over the other. We've already seen this. Choices in index development can lead to very different results. The framework we propose assesses these perspectives embodied by indices, even if the index developers are not aware themselves. I'll talk about that in just a moment. What we hope, what we intend, is for this framework to act as a bridge between technical experts, EPI index developers, and policymakers, governments, and us, so that we understand what an index represents and how to interpret the results that come from it. There are, of course, caveats. As with anything, we've made a binary division of perspectives, and that, of course, is an oversimplification. Of course, perspectives is a much larger, complex beast. We've chosen this in the spirit of the Occam's razor principle because we are trying to illustrate that perspectives can make a big difference in the narrative. And for us, making these two was sufficient to show what we wanted to show, to meet our goals. Many equity and fairness principles exist. A small selection of them here. We focus only on a subset, but again, that was sufficient to capture the goals, or rather meet the goals that we had set for ourselves. It can be related to purpose and not just values, came from at the insistence of one of our co-authors, which I'll talk about shortly. It's an interesting little story. But perhaps importantly, the way we operationalize, and I haven't shown that, but I will if you're interested, the way we operationalize our perspective is itself normative. We've chosen certain criteria to operationalize our perspectives framework. Okay, so a change of that framework will certainly change some of our results, but we expect the larger outcome, the larger interpretation to be the same. Okay, implications. First, for policymakers, the use of multiple indices is absolutely essential. Single index will not serve the purpose, but we are not just saying pick multiple indices, we are saying pick multiple indices from different parts of the perspective space. So given that we have this framework, it's not sufficient to take multiple indices that all lie in this range. They still represent just one perspective, only to a slightly greater or lesser degree. When we pick multiple indices for a more comprehensive understanding, it's important to pick them from different parts of your perspective space. Okay, that's what this framework enables. It enables us to understand where these indices sit and to ensure that we pick a few that represent different viewpoints. So is India a good or a bad performer on climate change? To go back to that question, when we look at the perspective space formalism, anything that you pick, any index you pick from this part will favor India, and the exact opposite will happen when you pick it from the other. So whether it's good or bad, possibly a disappointing response, will depend entirely on the perspective that we choose, and therefore it's really important not to, because if you ask the same thing about the UK, it'll flip.
Want to go to Australia?
Completely flips. The only thing that is immune to this change of perspective is the US. It is bad on every perspective. No kidding, really. Actually, it was there in the spatial map. If you saw, the US was always yellow and red, regardless of which one. Okay, and now we have Trump, so it's only going to get worse. The second is for index developers. What we hope is that this formulation will help to develop more balanced indices, or at the very least, stating what their index represents, what perspective it represents. For example, the EPI, if they had stated that it represents predominantly a biophysical, meaning climate perspective, and the CCPI, that it represents an equity perspective, it may, and that of course is conjecture, may have helped the the dialogue rather than it becoming so aggressive, where one country puts out a rebuttal and then the index developers rebut the rebuttal. And in the end, have we learned anything really new from that whole process, except that people are fighting? So that's what we hope could happen. And very interestingly, and this is where I go back to one of our co-authors, Sebastian Bloch. He's in fact the lead author of the last EPI. So after we wrote the paper, we actually circulated it to the last two lead authors. The EPI comes out every 2 years. So we sent it to the last two lead authors of the EPI, Sebastian and Martin Wolf. Martin Wolf is now with the IPCC technical support team. And interestingly, they did come back with very constructive comments. Although in some subtle way, we have critiqued the EPI. Of course, we've also critiqued many other entities, but they came back with very constructive comments. And Sebastian, because his comments were so substantive, we invited him to co-author the paper and help us improve it, which he did. Now, this one thing that, aside from this paper, what I hope is, because Sebastian expects to remain involved in index development, knowledge of this, and this came as a surprise, by the way, to him, this idea that the EPI represents one perspective to the complete exclusion of the other. That was not something which was evident to them at all. So this is not evident to index makers when they do it. What we hope is that, particularly because they're now aware, that they will take a little more care or be more transparent. So with that, I'll leave this as the last slide. We conjecture that transparency would aid dialogue rather than talking at cross purposes. And with that, I'm open to questions.
Questions? Shikha. Yeah, please.
Thank you for the talk. It was great. So as you were just mentioning that US is the one which is performing bad on all perspectives, be it the EPI or be it the equity linked CCP, equity linked index. At the same time, I saw in the spatial map that Afghanistan, if I believe it was, it performed really good on both the indices. So what can you comment upon how is Afghanistan doing that really?
Yeah. See, it's not surprising on the equity perspective because their emissions are extremely low. What was surprising was the EPI, why it's performing well there. They changed that. So that was EPI 2022. EPI 2024 was led by Martin Wolf. Sebastian led that one. Afghanistan is now a poor performer. So they could not stomach the idea that Afghanistan could be a good performer, and they changed it. And I know this for a fact because I've spoken to them. They asked themselves why, and they couldn't really find a good explanation, and therefore they changed the methodology.
Basically, it is all subjective to...
It is. Exactly. It is subjective. Yeah, that's precisely the point. It's subjective, and very often we take... and look, the EPI is backed by the Yale and Columbia universities. That's where their developers are sitting. And therefore, it's not even peer reviewed, but it's taken extremely seriously by governments, policymakers, and so on, which can determine investments, green investments. It can determine climate financial flows and so on. And that's why when you take one index with one perspective, which you don't even know very seriously, it can have serious repercussions in the real world.
Any own indicator after this?
Not to my knowledge, not that I've come across. Online, I suppose I should just repeat, has India come up with its own indices or indicators? Not that I'm aware of. If there are, then I've not yet looked at them, but they've not become prominent enough that it's made a global conversation happen.
So what is really your take? Is India a good performer, bad performer?
As I said, it's entirely perspective driven. Look, I would say this. From the perspective of the bottom 50%, India is a very good performer. maybe I need to think about this carefully. I probably need some time to think about it. Let me change that. From the perspective of Tuvalu or Vanuatu, small island nations that are literally at existential risk, they expect to be underwater, or rather impossible to live there in a few decades' time, sea level rise. Now, from their perspective, India would be a bad performer because although per capita emissions in India are very low, much lower than the global average, India's absolute emissions are still 3 billion tons, which is significant. But from the equity perspective, in terms of, you can separate out between luxury emissions and subsistence emissions, and this again comes from Agarwal and Narayan, where subsistence emissions are all those things we can't avoid. We need a job, we need to travel there, but luxury emissions would be real luxuries, multiple mansions, private jets, and so on. Now, if you distinguish between the two, most of India's emissions are subsistence emissions, at least in the top 90%, the bottom 90%. It's only the top 10% that has luxury emissions. Whereas for industrialized countries, a significant fraction of their emissions are luxury emissions. And so from that perspective, India is a good performer. So it really is an entirely perspective-driven case of how you assess a country, except the US. On every perspective, they're awful.
Yeah. There's a question from Aditi, I think from university, I guess. Aditi. So have you looked at a particular sector, say heat, stress, or health sector across the continents, or maybe just India, and how policies can be formulated for a better performance on both perspectives? So have you looked at a particular sector where the performance formulated for a better performance on both perspectives? Particular sector, both performers?
No, we have not distinguished sectors.
Okay.
But I think the second part is more interesting. What would allow a country to perform well on both perspectives? The two are actually divergent perspectives, the per capita and the cumulative emissions perspective. I think perhaps the planetary boundaries framework is useful in this context because that gives us a certain upper bound to what the per capita emission should be. And that's when you calculate that, it comes to 2 tons per person. Actually, India is already at that level. How to turn that argument into good performance in both is something I'll have to think about. I haven't considered that very carefully yet, so I would rather not hazard a.
Is there any common country for these two perspectives?
There are countries that perform moderately on both, which are the developing countries. So if you distinguish between developing, and least developed, the least developed and the most developed are where the performance flips in a major way.
Is this based on GDP, the developing?
Yes, it is. It is GDP per capita. So it's a categorization. So I think least developed would be lower than $2,000 per year. Developing countries would be such and such.
It's also against the baseline, or how it is?
That's
the current GDP. Or
yeah. You will adjust for inflation.
Then India already stands in the upper.
India will be in the developing country range. Yeah. So South America, for example, we find they perform. Their performance doesn't flip. It's roughly equivalent, regardless which one perspective you look at. Mostly South America.
Aditi, you have a question?
One last question. Like the climate tracker index.
Yeah.
The climate tracker index, it is like balancing both the perspectives, sort of, not completely. So I think that should be a better index to see.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure that's actually the case. For one thing, what happens is a climate action tracker is extremely difficult to understand what they've done. I don't think it is replicable. The EPI, one of the reasons we focus on the EPI is it's completely replicable. We could replicate the results exactly, and where we had questions, we asked them, the developers, and they were very open about the whole thing. CAT, Climate Action Tracker, is impossible to replicate. There's a lot of qualitative stuff in their development, and they claim they're taking some 20 different papers defining equity in different ways, and they're taking an average over that, and then they come out with some answer which is impossible now for the rest of us to understand. So whether it really, I mean, some of those equity, what are called equity in the literature is actually far from equity. One is called grandfathering. Grandfathering means if you're already emitting a lot, you have the right to emit quite a lot in the next year as well. The way they justify that is if you're already a high emitter, it's very difficult systemically to lower your emissions. And therefore, if you've already emitted a lot in the past, you have the right to continue emitting a lot in the future. Now, that's grandfathering. Is that an equity principle? I do not believe that. But the Climate Action Tracker will also push that into what they call equity. That's why I'm not really sure whether Climate Action Tracker, although technically it looks like it's sitting over there, because it's unreplicable, I don't generally favor the CAT.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Musai, there is a
as a world as a whole, for us to achieve what we were looking for.
I don't think we can take that. We don't have the luxury of taking one and projecting that as better than the other.
But one accounts for the warming and other accounts for the equity. So when we go for the equity perspective, it will demand time.
Yes.
When we, since considering the time, the little time we have, why can't the other one can be implemented?
That's an excellent point of view to take, that given that we don't have the luxury of time, we should take the other perspective. But someone coming from the other side would equally argue, well, who should take the action? Should it be us that have polluted very little, or should it be people that have polluted a lot? And if you take that, they might argue that time is irrelevant. We don't have the money. And that is really the case for a lot of developing and least developed countries. And that's a perfectly valid reason to say that the action should be on the basis of the polluter pays principle.
Okay, any other questions? All right, it's a very excellent talk. So let us thank audience.